Hello and welcome to Tech About Town, brought to you by Communitech and Elevate IP. I'm Alex Kinsella.
And I'm Allison Peel.
So today downstairs, wait, we're on the same floor. Never mind.
Oh, yeah.
On the same floor. Today in the Communitech Hub, we actually had a Communitech breakfast in the newly renovated cafe.
Newly renovated. So today was May 22nd, for those of you who are able to attend. That was awesome. So we actually did a big flip of the caf. And so our kitchen is kind of off to the side. We have a much longer, more welcoming, open experience. Little stage. We got a huge screen. It was really good, really well attended. Lots of great questions. Yeah, it was an excellent opportunity.
It's so much better. And if you ever came to an event in the second floor caf, I guess between 2016 and 2025, and then the windows were behind the speakers. Mm-hmm. And as someone who often takes photos at the events, it was horrible because then the light would come in and it would ruin everything. Yep. And now it's perfect. Like, it's absolutely the dopest spot now. I didn't take photos today.
I was the photographer today.
Oh, there you go. And wasn't it nice?
You'll be back next time. But
it's so much nicer.
It was because I didn't have to try to figure out how to get my body in the way to block some light. No. And there was a few areas that was a little dark. So we'll work on that with some lighting,
and the
maybe,
new
but
kitchen
it was
is
good.
Stupidly nice.
Yeah.
What's up with that floor?
Very fun, funky pattern, really cool. We're missing our, we don't have a big center island anymore, but we've got really nice high top seats that look out in the out of the window, which is a nice
I'm
feel.
In Paris when I'm in there.
A little bit. It's
Paris,
very
Ontario,
cafe.
But it's still.
We're going to go with Paris, France.
We'll go with Paris, France. All right. Well,
talking about global
look at
expansion.
That segue. Oh, that's nice. Well, we're going to talk about global expansion with our guest today, Dave Litwiller. Dave is a seasoned growth coach here at Communitech. We were talking before before we started recording. He's been here for ages. I used to work with him when I worked here, when he was still a growth coach. And Dave is a freelance marketing consultant and coach. He also is a growth coach here at Communitech. And today he's in the studio, which we're really excited. We're going to talk about governance. We're going to talk about when CEOs and founders need to
expand,
bring in more people, into leadership and delegate some stuff. So let's get the conversation rolling with Dave. So welcome to the studio.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Dave Litwiller. We're excited to have you in today. We've had some growth coaches in before. Always interesting kind of conversations because you bring in a level of expertise on a variety of things. But what's your kind of main focus right now as a growth coach and also as a management consultant?
So the main focus of my work is scale-up stage companies, predominantly based here in the region, where they're at the point that it's no longer in doubt that there is a viable core business in what they're doing. The remaining questions are how big and how fast can they expand the footprint of what they're doing. And generally related to that is that the leadership of the business has grown beyond the level at which a few very capable founders and near founders can handle the majority of the executive roles, and it becomes necessary to share executive decision authority and action with a wider cast of characters. And that is generally the nature of the companies that I work with and the nature of the engagements that I have with them for the sort of help that they're looking for.
No, I think we've all worked at different size companies, and something you just said kind of brought up an experience I had where we had a startup with young founders, and it's, as a founder, you're doing everything, right? You are the CEO, your marketing, your product, sometimes your customer service, you might be taking out the trash. Delegating, though, as you reach that, once that business becomes really viable and this is going to become something, delegating and giving up that power can be challenging for a lot of people who are used to that control, or it's their baby and they really want to see it succeed and they can't give that up.
Yes.
Have you faced challenges like that? And if you have, how do you kind of coach people to let go?
So I couldn't agree more. For some people, especially, perhaps more than others, it's some of the most difficult challenges they ever face of letting go of something when they care so passionately about everything that goes on in the business and the customer experience that comes out, and trusting some significant portion of that to somebody else and letting partially go. It really is a challenge and a transition. The main way I come at that with people who need or are looking for some help is to talk about, the idea of delegation without abdication. How do you describe at a more meta level what are the guardrails, the rules of the road for the decision authority that you are delegating, at least most of the time under routine circumstances, to others, so that the executive or founder who's letting go or partially go of something can feel comfortable that they've described at least higher level objectives that still capture the core principles of how they want that function or workflow executed. But at the same time, the newly appointed or elevated individual who's going to be taking over, those managerial or executive authorities have, a clear understanding of what they can do, how to do it, what the limits are beyond which they do need to go and get special authority and things like that. So I sort of talk in those rules of the road, guardrails, that and being able to try and define the interface between what's being let go and what's being assumed by the incoming individual in those terms.
The other part of that too, though, is when you're giving stuff up, the delegation is one thing. As you kind of get to that scale side of the scale stage of a startup, you have a board and maybe a more active board, or you've expanded your board to be a little bit more, to provide a little more guidance, I guess. And so how do you see founders adjusting to that, and kind of what are some of the challenges or tips even for founders who need to adapt themselves now as they're a CEO and the board could technically fire them?
Very good question and point. The evolution with the governance and the board, and especially as the companies get larger, often they've started to take in one or several rounds of institutional venture capital in many cases. Many directors are on the board because they or the institution they represent have paid for the right and have taken the risk to be there, and they expect to have influence. They expect their points of view to at least have significant weight in the ultimate deliberations that are made. And that's a very different world from the earlier stage where it may be friends and family money, and really just the founders that represent the governance. And so that sharing of power, figuring out how that's going to work, but in the mechanics of action, when helping founders and CEOs deal with larger boards that operate with more formalism and necessarily so, and with directors who do need to exercise, their duty of care, duty of to be informed, and fiduciary duties. It's the idea that the board meetings themselves are really only the final act, and a lot of the management of the relationship is what's happening, in between the formal board meetings. Are you having one-on-one discussions with your directors and your investors on a regular cadence? Do you understand what their sensitivities and issues are, so that the founder, the executive, has a larger picture of what's driving the leadership at the board level, beyond what's happening just in the board meetings themselves, so that they have the ability to adapt their approach, rebut in certain cases, the ideas that they may not agree with as much, but to be able to deal with those things as constructively and early as possible, as opposed to leaning back, just waiting for the formally constituted board meetings to happen and then being surprised when what necessarily needs to be a greater degree of power sharing than what may have been the experience early on for that company and that founder or CEO. That's the kind of evolution in thinking, but it's about having a plan. It's about having a cadence, a rhythm, being comfortable with those one-on-one conversations that are happening all the time, making sure that there are as few surprises on both sides of the relationship, even if some of the time, hey, the news isn't great, the plan's got to change, and people aren't loving it in the moment while it's happening. But all the same, those things are a lot more manageable and tolerable for people if they feel the trust in the communication and the early communication mechanisms are there, as opposed to if they're finding about stuff just a little too late and things like that. So that's the typical evolution that we sort of talk about with people.
How do you know when? Like, when is the right time that you want to bring in another C-level human, or as the founder potentially go to like co-CEO versus, because as Alex said, like when you're a founder, you're doing it all, right?
Yes.
So what would you say to a founder as to like, when you hit, are there benchmarks? Like when you hit X, this is when you want to look at X.
One of the guiding precepts in sort of high growth businesses, and there rarely is there a perfect execution of this, but it's the aspirational ideal, is if you want to grow quickly, whether you're the CEO or a very influential co-founder or somebody else who was part of the early success of the organization, who's in a senior role, you can't become the bottleneck to the growth of the business. And the follow-on from that is the moment that it becomes clear that somebody else could actually do significant parts of what you're currently doing as well and preferably better than you are, that usually is the strongest, albeit qualitative, sign that there is room for additional leadership, and that at some level the communication and interaction costs of handing that off to somebody else and then managing that relationship and the interaction dynamics on a go-forward basis are likely going to be more than paid off by the benefits of getting somebody who is even stronger and perhaps has more forward-looking capability with where the business is likely going to be able to handle those matters of that portfolio of tasks.
I was going to say, you kind of see that happening with, and on the board, and also delegation is OpenAI as a kind of a big example. They had some board issues where the board fired their CEO. He came back. They have a new board. One of those board members was the former CEO of Instacart, who's now a CEO of Applications, I think is the title she has now.
That's right. Generate revenue, whatever the title is. Yes.
Yeah, but it's an interesting, when you kind of look at that as an example of one of they're delegating. Normally I would see it like that's like a VP of product or something, right? Or SVP of product. And they're doing these like CEO roles of businesses as like, if I think of like non-tech companies, all have a similar structure: CEO, CFO, blah, 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 down the line.
Yes.
Where tech can kind of get a little, like you have a lot of co-CEO situations. We bring in like chief revenue officers, chief technical officers, chief strategy, CISOs, right? Because that's a big one now, especially in tech. How do you kind of know how to structure that? Like every company is going to be different, but within tech, when you're coaching anyone around this, do you ever have a situation where they're like, I didn't know I needed a CISO?
Yes. So
I should say what a CISO is.
Maybe.
I do this.
I see there as being two phenomena that are interacting. One is that there's a very fluid situation generally with trying to optimize the leadership of high growth companies. They're operating at the intersection of rapidly changing technology, rapidly changing markets and competitive environments, and their internal makeup of who's in the company often tends to also be pretty dynamic. So how you re-optimize that on an ongoing basis to try to match the best skills and the best structure with what the business is aiming to achieve, at least over the next year, 18 months, to me, that's what drives part of those less conventional arrangements outside of tech, but where it is a very useful and pragmatic part of the toolbox of how to make things work in the moment and over at least the near term in those businesses. But then there's a second part of it, which I would argue is more in the category of job title inflation, where the world has just kept ratcheting up, and there has yet to be a compelling force to ratchet back down the, apparent seniority of many job titles. When I started my career, you had a sales manager or perhaps a director or VP of sales if it was a much larger company. Now we have chief revenue officers, but if I were to show you a job description of a chief revenue officer of today versus a director of sales, from when I started my career, these things looked about the same.
Right.
The only thing that's different is, how the flourish is on the job title. So I think that there is some job title escalation now in the case of the Instacart CEO moving over to OpenAI. To go from the CEO job to something else, you were probably going to need to negotiate on title if you were going to get somebody that strong. So, I can understand without having been in the room and having, no particular firsthand knowledge of what went down there. I can see in a situation like that where you absolutely are going to be willing to inflate the title if that's the only thing that's the difference between closing on this person and not closing, if you're convinced this is the right person to take the company to the next level. So in that one, it's like, there are some very special circumstances, and I probably would have done the same thing if the facts on the ground are what I believe them to be. But in general, it doesn't sort of. Those should be more special situations than the norm with some of the job title inflation.
The one question I always kind of have too, and I don't know if you ever think about this one too, but when we talk to early stage founders, 99 times out of 100, their goal is to be the CEO. So they're founder and CEO, sometimes co-founder CEO, but usually founder and CEO, that's what I'm going to be.
Yes.
Do you think that a lot of the early stage ones have an idea of what a CEO needs to be at these different stages? Because I think some of the challenge that we have now going from startup to scale is they led the company to X and the job description changes, the title stays the same.
Yes. Yeah. And so I agree very much with the, sort of the question and the phenomenon that you're describing. I'm going to put numbers to something where numbers really don't apply, but I think it was the founder of Rakuten who made the observation after he had led the business through hypergrowth, and he basically said, look, at every factor of 3 change in scale of the business, pretty much everything broke. And we had to entirely reimagine the workflows, the processes, what sort of skills and leadership, throughout the stack of the management of the business that they required. And while that rule of factor of 3 might not be exactly and precisely right, I think directionally there's a lot of wisdom in that. And that to me is the reason why. It's a very natural evolution. It's not a failing in the companies I work with, the founders that I work with. In the cases where I've been a part of counseling people who are going through a transition like that, whether it was an inbound CEO or other senior leader who is going to be taking over some or all of the duties of a founder or former CEO who has realized, I was the right person to get the business to where it is, but something different's needed to go to the next level or next few levels. And the dimensions of the job, the skills that it takes. I mean, it's if anything, the really amazing thing is, the Bill Gates type of story, the founder who could lead the person or who could be the person to lead the company, to astronomical scale. But, the mental dexterity, the physical endurance, the mental fortitude to be able to navigate all of those transitions, that's an amazing thing. And because of how fast businesses change and the needs of the business change when they are rapidly growing and successfully competing in very dynamic markets, it's far from unusual that at some point, even very dynamic people who had immeasurable, incomparable contribution to the business early on in its success, one way or another, get to the point where they say, hey, you know what, somebody else needs to at least carry a portion of my duties, if not the majority of them, for this to really work.
Yeah, it's interesting because I worked for a startup quite some time ago, and I was the second external employee that had joined the company. So everybody else, like the head of marketing was the co-op they hired, 4 years earlier. And the co-founders were CEO and CTO, but then like the head of product was their friend that was like doing dev, like part-time for them. And it was really interesting because when I came in, I was like, what about this? What about this? Who does this? And then they had decided to bring a salesperson in. So that gentleman started right before I did. And there was a big, like, kind of almost like a power struggle in a way of like,
yes,
I understand you have these awesome humans at the table, but I have these humans who have 25, 30 years experience who are saying to you, like, maybe let's bring a consultant in to help with this. We've got this person over here. And yeah, they got that company to X, but then they were struggling to say, okay, Sally, you're not the right person anymore to carry it forward. We've got to bring someone over top of you to do that.
Yes.
Forward carrying, right?
And it is, in my work, even very much echoing what you've shared as a personal anecdote, the cognitive dissonance for at least some people that absolutely the behaviors, the priorities, the effort that consistently and observably delivered so much impact, being challenged that is perhaps not the formula that's going to go the next leg of the journey. A lot of people who do work like me, have a saying, what you here won't get you there. But it's a version of that, and very much, it's certainly a recurring sort of pattern of behavior. Not everywhere, not always, but it's far from unusual when we see something like that crop up in our work.
Yeah. It's very interesting. It's like some will also say, keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep getting what you're getting, right?
Yes.
And then but nobody wants to be the one to be like, we need somebody, not because you're not excellent, but because we need that different external vision, right?
Yes, and it was excellent under a different success criteria that was very valid.
Exactly,
essential at the time, but in fact, it's a different success criteria. It's a different scoring rubric for those who are inclined to think in those terms. And it's things do need to move on and turn the page.
Yeah, exactly, 100%.
It's like context drives it.
Yes.
Context is what really makes that decision. Another bit of context right now, kind of switching gears a little bit. One of the things you also mentor about and coach on is global expansion, international expansion. in terms of context right now, holy shit, like there's a lot happening around the world, not just south of the border,
Yes.
that could make scaling companies question their plans, right? Everyone has a plan till you get punched in the mouth. And right now, Canada especially, along with a bunch of other places, are getting punched in the mouth.
Yes.
What's your advice now to and any level of founder, but really kind of on that either just getting ready to scale or in the process of scaling? Like, how do you kind of look at the market?
So let me talk about at least one basic bifurcation among the tech community that I work with. So in general, the pure SaaS companies are for the moment less concerned. I don't want to say unconcerned. They are less concerned with what has gone down thus far because, generally, the services and software as a service has not been as directly impacted. Now, it remains to be seen with the objections that the U.S. administration has on value-added taxes and digital service taxes, whether that remains as a larger trade dialogue plays out. I don't have any insight or privileged knowledge on that, but it's something that I'm mindful of, is just because that shoe hasn't dropped thus far doesn't mean that we aren't going to be hearing about this at some point. On the hardware side, or where there's a sizable hardware component to the product and service offering, those people are first order, have been all in, all consumed with this issue in general. Whether they're affected by the changing nature of the supply lines, wherever, portions of their components or raw materials are coming from, or whether it's the markets that they sell into on the demand side, everybody has had to make many adjustments already, develop certain hedging strategies, do certain things to at least buy themselves some time. Well, they get to see if certain things sort out before they make larger structural or systemic changes to their business model, their operational models, things like that. But as sort of broad stroke statements, that's what I've seen unfold in the client base that I work with to this point.
Interesting perspective, because we actually just this morning had a breakfast on like global expansion and market diversity and stuff like that. And I always wondered, like, what are some ways that founders would know and how to try to test a new market? Like, what would you guide them on doing? Like, is it a jump in both feet? Is it a small pilot? Like, how do you get them? How do they try them? Because I think a lot of hardware founders are probably gearing towards a little less towards the US, which would maybe be a more recognized market, and trying to move towards potentially Europe, Asia Pac, and other markets outside of the US.
So the way that I think about that and the kind of experience I try to share with people is it depends to a degree on what scale of diversification you're trying to achieve. So I'll give like two fairly extreme examples. At the one extreme, maybe the business isn't yet that big, and a few 100,000 of revenue diversification in Europe or Asia Pac, if historically it was predominantly in North America, is enough, or at least useful diversification. Often when it's relatively small absolute dollars that people need, you can generate business in foreign markets, but not really change your way of doing business or your business practices very much. I mean, there's a few things you need to do to take care of the import and export and the currency conversion, and maybe you need to change some things for language, and there may be some local regulations, but more or less, they're still doing business the way they've done it predominantly in North America. And they're sort of taking the those new geos on an opportunistic basis, where there are customers that are willing to more or less conform to the current way we do business. We'll make some incremental efforts, but not bend ourselves out of shape too much and go grab that business. But then there's the much larger diversification strategy, which is where you truly need to build a business abroad that is comparable in scale to what may have more organically and earlier grown in North America. And in cases like that, the larger the win that is sought in foreign markets, the more that typically almost everything about the business needs to at least be able to flex to adapt to the winning formula for how to do a lot of business in those markets. So while the core platforms of the business, the enabling technology, will carry forward and extend, the degree of product adaptation, the degree to which business terms and conditions get adapted, whether you need people on the ground locally who speak the local language and who can really get the insight into the local culture, or whether you're working through distribution partners, perhaps for the first time, and figuring out the mechanics of all of that. It's that the bigger wins, the larger absolute dollars that you're going to try and gain in foreign markets, when it becomes a must-have, not a nice-to-have, to get that diversification. That's where a lot more flexibility, at least on the details of implementation, about almost everything about how the business is working, needs to be at least. People need to be able to discuss and potentially implement those sorts of changes, as opposed to we're just going to grab the incremental business that largely conforms to the product, the service delivery, and the business model that we presently operate on. And even more so if the best opportunities are in emerging markets rather than developed markets, where now you're sort of into the second derivative of change. And again, there still can be very high value use cases for the foundational technologies, but you may be dealing at radically different price points, radically different go-to-market models, among other things, and the business really needs to have the flexibility to adjust to that.
With all this, like kind of looking across the conversation, because it's already been 30 minutes, which kind of just blew my mind when I looked at this. Across boards and knowing when to abdicate versus delegate, across all of that, when you're talking to founders now, CEOs and founders, what is like the one thing that you see crop up, like the one kind of question, or maybe the one thing they all don't see when you're mentoring and when coaching?
I'm very fortunate that I work in general with such a talented group of people, and the privilege of working in the scale up space is a lot of the early stage Darwinism in a corporate sense has played out. You're working with people who, at least up to a point, have really stood the test of time about their adaptability, their effort level, their skill, the passion for the business. And so I wouldn't say that there is a consistent, sort of weak point. But what I would say, just sort of going to the later part of our conversation, more about on the international expansion, is you've got two competing forces always when you're looking to diversify a business. Diversification in general is a good thing up to a point, but if you diversify too much, you're spreading too thin. You're just not getting enough resources, talent, effort on any one initiative, and everything or most things may fall pretty flat. And so something where perhaps there is a little more consistency to where I'm, giving people some advice today who are committed to rapid geographic diversification of their business is, generally think about 3 to 5 markets where you've got enough diversity that if one or two of them end up not coming around for you for whatever reason, the whole initiative isn't dead on arrival because you still have enough irons in the fire that you're going to get at least some output from that effort. But to not generally go bigger than that, because when you start dealing with the regulatory issues, the language issues, the local support issues, let alone different go-to-market mechanics or motions, let alone product localization and adaptation, it can become overwhelming. So I'm often sort of encouraging people for at least one concrete thought experiment. Doesn't mean it's the right strategy to ultimately decide on, but as a thought experiment, consider the case that you put an artificial limit on, we're going to go to market in 3 to 5 distinct foreign geographies in a sizable way. What would our best candidates be, and what would our best operational development and go-to-market makeup look like to potentially do that? And again, doesn't mean that that's exactly where they end up in the process, but I find that that's a useful thought experiment as kind of a forcing function around rapid diversification.
I also like the Darwinism thing.
Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you so much for joining us today. Like, this was
excellent. Super informative.
I really appreciate that. It's been great to be invited to come in, and it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. I always like when we kind of go off. Like, I had my set questions, and then we just went in a different direction. So thanks for vibing with us on this. As always, if you have questions about how you can get your own time book with Dave as a growth coach here at Communitech, you can visit communitech.ca to learn more about all the programs and memberships that are available to you, and no matter what stage of a tech leader you're at, what size or what stage your company is at. And you can always follow along with Communitech on social media at Communitech on all the major platforms. But thank you again for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.